Sociology 345 video lecture 08. I'm going to be presenting some ideas from the article Discourse of Civil Society, a New Proposal for Cultural Studies by Jeff Alexander and Philip Smith from 1993, published in Theory and Society. And one of the main points that they're making about how to think about culture, because that's still what we're doing here, thinking about how to think about culture, is this idea that we need to come up with a way of thinking about culture that is neither idealism nor reductionism. So what do they mean by that? Idealism, as they describe it, is an approach to thinking about culture that dominated sociological thinking from the 1940s through the 1960s. It's the idea that culture and values lead directly to action. So it's kind of builds on that Weberian idea that culture drives society. But the problem with this, according to Alexander and Smith, is that this arrow right here, this relationship, is never really fully explored empirically. It's just kind of assumed that values are primary and that they lead directly to action. And the problem with this is one has to wonder then, how does anything ever change? Why do our cultural values change? How do they change? That is, if cultural values lead directly to action, and that's all there is, how can there be anything but action that reaffirms or reifies what's already in existence? And that's clearly not the case. I mean, things do change, and people act in ways that are unexpected. And so how are we supposed to think about that? How are we supposed to think about the idea of free will, for example? And Mark Twain, in his usual humorous way, put it this way. He said, "I have a higher and grander standard of principle than George Washington. He could not lie. I can, but I won't." And that's kind of funny to think about from this sociological perspective, because sort of what he's saying here is that George Washington was really not free. His values were so overpowering, as he said it, he could not tell a lie. Whereas Mark Twain says, well, I can, but I choose not to. He highlights more agency, more of the ability of an actor to act in relation to social structure or cultural structure, but not totally determined by it. He gets to the same place. He says he's not going to lie, but it isn't the case that he can't. It's that he chooses. The other approach to thinking about culture that Alexander and Smith think that we need to get beyond is the idea of reductionism. And reductionism dominates sociological thinking about culture since the 1960s and going forward. Reductionism takes that idea from idealism that says, yes, culture and values lead to or determine social action. And then they say, but it's social structure that leads to culture and values that then in turn leads to action. It says culture is an intermediate step, so to speak. And this should sound very familiar to us because this is a very Marxist idea. The idea that social structure, or the base, leads to the superstructure, culture, values, ideologies, norms, and those things in turn dictate action. But again, it's these links that are never really explored empirically, and this is what bothers Alexander and Smith. It's just assumed, in Marxism, for example, in the Marxist explanation, that the culture will obviously reflect the means of production, whatever the particular social arrangements are. And here's the joke for that one. I blame society. It's got the same problem as idealism. It doesn't account for human action or human agency. It doesn't account for the individual and the individual's ability to act in relation to social structure, not just to have one's actions completely dictated by social structure. So we have this thing, we do something wrong and we just simply refuse to take responsibility and say, well, I blame society. And obviously it's an oversimplification. It can't really work that way. So how does it really work, according to Alexander and Smith? Well, they want us to think about it this way. Simply make it more dynamic. That there's a kind of give and take. And there's this, intuitively, this just should make sense to us, I think, that action is not wholly determined by culture, but it certainly is guided by culture. But then again, action has the ability to change culture. And culture, sure, it emerges from social structures and arrangements, social arrangements and the means of production, etc., material relations. But those things change and culture changes, and they change simultaneously, and they change in concert with one another. And so this should just make sense to us. And Alexander and Smith go further, though, and they tell us that the way this actually works, because remember their criticism of these other approaches was that there was no kind of empirical examination of how it, what are the mechanics, what are the nuts and bolts, how does this actually happen? And they say this is how it actually happens. What culture provides is a set of codes. We call them discursive codes, literally language and ideas that we use in discourse. And social actors can use this discourse creatively. And doing that, they make their world meaningful, and they can also create change. They can maintain their culture and society, and they can change their culture and society by combining and recombining these codes in new and different ways. So it still says that culture is important and puts constraints on action and meaning, but it doesn't wholly determine it, because these codes that make up culture can be combined and recombined in interesting ways to create social change. And this goes on in everyday life, and it also goes on more dramatically. So if we can think about a dramatic case like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. And the genius of Martin Luther King Jr. was his ability to take the codes of our culture in the United States, the things we valued most, like equality and freedom, and combine them in new and different ways, and force us to apply them to institutions that they had not, to which they had previously not been applied. And by doing that, to force us to dismantle certain institutions associated with racism, because we had to, we were compelled to, because it was the only way to maintain the values that we already believed in. And again, it was his ability to combine and recombine and take ideas and values and norms from the religious sector and from the public sector and combine them in different ways and create these compelling arguments that motivated the actions that led to the civil rights movement. These cultural codes, it turns out, according to Alexander and Smith, come from, or they're best understood in terms of the ideas of Emile Durkheim, who, like the way we've talked about Marx and talked about Weber, we consider Durkheim one of the founding figures of the discipline of sociology, French sociologist, again from that turn of the century period, 19th to the 20th century. Durkheim was interested in studying religions and secular societies and asking questions about how it is that secular societies maintain their cohesion, what holds them together, was easy to see in tribal societies and religious societies where ideas about the sacred really helped hold a society together, a set of common beliefs enacted through rites and rituals. And Durkheim came to the conclusion that secular societies essentially worked in exactly the same way, that there's a basic cultural code, a dichotomous code, meaning simply it has two sides. And every culture understands that which is sacred to the culture and that which is the opposite, that which is profane. And he said that there can be no society which does not feel the need of upholding and reaffirming at regular intervals the collective sentiments and the collective ideas which make its unity and its personality. So we have here a Native American totem pole from the Northwest. And we have this, that every kid growing up and socializing in the United States recognizes. Essentially the same thing. A set of values and ideas that are embodied in a form, in an object, that we in some sense worship, that are in many ways sacred. So the way a religious community holds itself together and the way a secular society holds itself together, not really that different. And in the article that you're reading by Alexander and Smith, you'll find these tables. And these tables describe a sacred and profane structure that revolves around what Alexander and Smith call the democratic code and the counter-democratic code. Democracy being sacred and counter-democracy being profane. And they developed this code, or they recognized this code at work in speeches by presidents over time that they've analyzed. And that's a good data set to look at. Speeches by presidents which are always, in a sense, symbolic and ritualistic. There's a ritual, ceremonial character to when presidents make speeches, but they're also highly practical and political at exactly the same time, so that they're sacred and ritualistic and practical. They're about action. And analyzing presidents' speeches over a long period of time, you find that this code emerges. It's a sacred and profane code, but it's enacted around democratic, counter-democratic ideas. And there's a specific discursive kind of structure with which presidents, and by extension all of us, describe what we value in terms of social actors. So the social actors that we value are, and the qualities that we value in our culture, in a person, in a social actor, are these. People who are active, who are autonomous or free, people who are rational, people who are reasonable, calm, controlled, realistic, sane, as opposed to the counter-democratic side, which would be passive, takes no action, dependent, as opposed to autonomous. This is what, in the last campaign, what the Romney campaign talked about, the takers of society, that this criticism they launched against people that they claimed are dependent on government. And of course there was a lot of debate about who these people are or whether they actually exist, etc. But the reason it was an effective device for having an argument was because it activates this sense of right and wrong, this sense of sacred and profane. People who are overly dependent on the government or anyone, they're not highly valued people. And, any side, Democratic or Republican, is going to agree about that. They disagree on who's more dependent and who's less dependent and whether or not people are legitimately dependent, etc. But it all revolves around this kind of code. And I often hear this when I'm discussing things with my friends who will inevitably describe people who disagree with them as being irrational or insane or mad or unrealistic. So we have these discursive codes that are used about actors. We also have discursive codes used to describe social relationships, that which is valued and that which is not. Open, trusting, critical, truthful, straightforward, the idea of the citizen versus secret, suspicious, deferential, deceitful, calculating, the enemy. And discursive structures of social institutions. And this is where we see that valued, or the valued aspects of a bureaucracy, where the democratic institution is rule regulated. It's about law and equality, and it's inclusive and impersonal. And it's contractual, and it's about the group. And it's about the office. That's where authority lies, in the office, as opposed to being arbitrary, driven by power, hierarchy, exclusive, personal, ascriptive, about factions rather than the whole group, about personality as opposed to office. So this is literally a tool you can use to understand how a society is operating, and the way that these codes are combined and recombined and applied in new and novel ways are ways that the system is both maintained and can be changed. And you see this most dramatically, like I said, in ritual events, in commemorations, for example. This is Ground Zero. And the debates around how to commemorate those events of 9/11, if you look at those, they're amazing and heated, and they do revolve around these democratic, counter-democratic codes. Because potentially this site is as important as the Statue of Liberty. Since Alexander and Smith analyzed president's speeches, I thought it'd be interesting to look at President Obama's inaugural address. This is his first inaugural address. I think what we'll do in class probably is look at his most recent inaugural address and have you guys work through finding these codes at work and see how he uses them. But these are some of the statements from his first inaugural address, where he said, "I stand here today humbled by the task before us, grateful for the trust you have bestowed, mindful of the sacrifices borne by our ancestors. I thank President Bush for his service to our nation, as well as the generosity and cooperation he has shown throughout this transition." And when we talk about codes at work, or discursive structures, we can literally talk about the words that get used, the adjectives, the phrases. And we can go through and we can find these things that we would identify as aspects of the sacred. We the people, faithful to the ideals of our forebears and true to our founding documents. Inevitably, in these speeches, we can also find instances of the profane. Here, Obama says that we are in the midst of a crisis. This is when he came into office. It's now well understood our nation is at war against a far-reaching network of violence and hatred. Our economy is badly weakened, a consequence of greed and irresponsibility on the part of some, but also our collective failure to make hard choices and prepare the nation for a new age. Find aspects of the profane. And in turn, you can break it down further and say, well, what we've got here are aspects of the democratic code as it is applied to actors. Actors should be active, autonomous, rational, reasonable, calm, controlled, realistic, sane. And relationships, which should be open, and trusting, and truthful, and straightforward. true and faithful to our founding ideals. And aspects of the counter-democratic actor: irresponsible, irrational, greed, violence, hatred. In opposition to the democratic relationship: cooperative, generosity. So again, the idea is that these codes exist and they're powerful and they structure the way we think, but we can always combine and recombine them in new and interesting ways, and thus change the culture, change the way we think, and in turn change society.